Hello, welcome to the Garrett Ashley Mullet Show. I am Garrett Ashley Mullet, your host. Today, our video is brought to you by the letter A and the number 12. I don't know why, I just picked those randomly. In any event, what we're going to talk about is the path of least resistance. What brings this topic to mind is the fact of political disunity and division and strife in our country, as evidenced by protests, as evidenced by a 6 or 7 block radius of downtown Seattle declaring itself now a independent sovereign nation, as evidenced by former Secretary of Defense Mattis coming out as furious that senior members of the United States military appeared in a photo op that President Trump staged at the church, St. John's Church across from the White House, in the wake of protests which had set fire to that church, which had besieged the White House, which had set fire to many American cities across the country in the wake of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the hands of law enforcement. General Mattis, for instance, said that he was dismayed, to put it lightly, that senior military officials had appeared with President Trump as if they supported him, as if they were on his side, at a time when many on the left are decrying President Trump for having sown the seeds of division. Mattis certainly is taking that position, that President Trump is dividing us, not uniting us. But what's rich about that is the fact of now 3 years of unfavorable media coverage, would be dishonest, of outright hostile media coverage from the main news outlets in the United States of America and around the world, but particularly in this country. A very hostile press which covers everything that Trump says and does, everything that he doesn't say and doesn't do, as if it is a scandal. By contrast, the claim was made and allowed to pass on the left that Barack Obama had a scandal-free administration, which was patently false. But it was true insofar as the left heard no evil, saw no evil, and spoke no evil with regards to Barack Obama. They were ignorant. They purposefully ignored and deflected attention away from the scandals of his administration because he was doing the things that they wanted him to do. They were in the bag for the Obama administration, for the progressive agenda, and they are decidedly hostile to Trump, not because of Trump himself, but because Trump is working, has been working, promised to work to undermine and counteract and to negate the Obama legacy, the progressive agenda in America, by reducing taxes, by reducing regulation, by changing government branches and bureaucracies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, from activist agendas, activist footing, hostile anti-business, progressive aims. He changed their missions and their aims back to what they should have been all along, which is protecting the American people in general from clear and present danger. Not from pie in the sky is falling, we're all going to die alarmism, not from activism dressed up as science, but from clear and present danger. And thinking holistically has gotten Trump no love from the left. Thinking about more than just one issue in the grand scheme of our nation's concerns has gotten him anything but love. In fact, as he's tackled Iran, for instance, or North Korea, for instance, or our porous border with Mexico, for instance, or any of the things that he promised to tackle as president, the left has been there at every turn to make a scandal out of anything that he says, anything that he does, anything that he doesn't say, anything that he doesn't do. And at the end of the day, to blame Trump for the left's abject hatred of him and abject hatred of his supporters and his voters, of conservative Americans, of Republicans, of supposed quote-unquote flyover country, middle America, to blame Trump and the Republicans for that is willful dishonesty. It is a misrepresentation of reality. And all I can figure from Mattis's choosing to engage in this kind of partisan hackery dressed up as nonpartisan objective patriotism is that Mr. Mattis, former Secretary of Defense Mattis, has decided that he is no longer going to stay out of the fray. He's no longer going to be above all of that. He is going to be partisan. Only he hasn't quite admitted it to himself, or if he has, he's not willing yet to admit it to us. But you think about the influence that a man with the stature of Mattis has on the military community and on anybody on the left who's looking for the least little bit of chum in the water, the least little bit of encouragement to continue the quote-unquote resistance against President Trump's agenda and conservative Americans. What Mattis is doing is divisive. What Trump is doing in trying to carry out his obligations to uphold his oath of office, to serve and protect the American people, to uphold and defend the United States Constitution, that is not divisive. And it does not become divisive simply by virtue of the left being angrily against it. It does not become divisive simply because an army of angry leftists is opposed to it. Hi. To say that Trump is the problem is, in my opinion, to take the path of least resistance. And it is a kind of throwing in the towel on the part of anybody who was truly objective and in the middle. It is a kind of throwing in the towel for any conservatives who are engaging in that, raising a white flag and saying, I surrender, these guys are going to win, and I'm just going to go for what I think are going to be the winning sides in this conflict. I'm going to pick their side. I'm going to say, let's call for unity. And then, lo and behold, it'll be unity on the terms of the left. There's no other way for me to see this. I have enjoyed Mattis's quotes as much as any red-blooded American over the years. I read his book, but I do not respect the way that he has decided to involve himself and participate in the current fracas. I find it unhelpful, to say the least. He may have his opinion, he may have his honest opinion, but given what I read in his book, Call Sign Chaos, I cannot respect the stance that he's taking right now, because it seems to me as though he has changed his mind, but he doesn't want to admit it. He said one thing, he's doing another, which makes him a hypocrite. What's at stake is the soul of America. And whether you're on the right, or you're on the left, or you're in the middle, if you're an honest person who's been paying attention, you know that what's at stake is the soul of America. When it's being claimed that we are a racist country, and that racism is in our DNA, thank you, Obama, when it is being claimed that we need to tear down statues of Christopher Columbus and Thomas Jefferson and not only Confederate leaders, but Revolutionary War heroes. We need to take down the Jefferson Memorial and the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. in order to do penance for the sin of slavery. When that is being claimed by the left, there is no question that the left perceives this as a war for the soul of America, not only for the soul of America today, but for the soul of America of tomorrow, the country that we're going to be moving forward, the country that our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, should the world stand that long, are going to inherit from us. What is, from all sides, at stake right now is the kind of country we're going to be, and the kind of country we will be decided quite a bit by how we see the country that we have been in the past. If we see our country as having been imperfect, but based on rock-solid, universal principles of truth, justice, and liberty, then we will be one kind of country. If we see our country as having been always oppressive of women and minorities, always unjust, always hypocritical, always saying one thing but actually doing another, if we see that as being the rule rather than the exception, then it naturally follows we need to change our wicked ways. We need to repent. If you claim that America is systemically racist, the only thing for it is to dismantle the system or to radically overhaul the system. If the system is not systemically racist against Black Americans and other people of color, then it naturally follows that we do not need to overhaul our system, and that calls to the contrary are going to be hugely disruptive and counterproductive. They're going to do more harm than good if we had a good system, and now you're going to suddenly shuffle the deck and make it into something completely different. Now, if we're going to make it something completely different now, moving forward, because the charge of systemic racism will stand, or because a strong, vocal, highly energetic, highly motivated minority of Americans are pushing forward that narrative, and they're willing to cause a lot of destruction and make a lot of threats and carry out a lot of acts of vandalism and destruction of private property and public property to get their way, if they're going to be allowed to take the day and seize the field, and we're going to just retreat in their wake, then we are going to be a very, very different country moving forward. And it's going to be an ugly place to be for anyone who insists and maintains that the old system was just fine. If you're going to charge the traditional Americana Norman Rockwell vision that in the 1950s and before that we had of ourselves, if you're going to condemn that as not only naive, not only as dishonest or inaccurate, but as evil and as unjust, what place does that leave for those Americans who continue to insist that that is the reality, that was the reality, that will always have been the reality? However far into the future we get, whatever changes are instituted, that will always be the reality, and we, damn it, refuse to go along with these claims to the contrary. In fact, we see them as slanderous, as libelous. I've got 6 sons so far. My oldest son turns 13 next month. It's easy for me to ask him to do something, but it is not always the best policy. In fact, often it is not good for my younger children to be given their way or to be given an easy time of it, so long as they're going to be more difficult than my oldest son is. It also is not fair to my oldest son to always be given the work that needs to be done just because his little brothers and his little sister don't want to do it. If I give into that tendency or that inclination, that temptation to take the path of least resistance too much, what I do is I deprive my younger children of the opportunity to gain skills and develop character. I give them a license to be difficult because they know that if they're difficult for long enough, and if they're difficult enough, that they're going to get what they want, they're also going to not have to do the things that they don't want to do. If I encourage that, then my house is going to be chaotic. I'm going to have strife all the time as my children try to outdo one another to see who can be the most ridiculous and the least easy to work with. I'm also going to have children who are not practiced in taking responsibility for the things that they need to, who are not reasonable. They don't need to be reasonable. So long as I'm going to take the path of least resistance, I am encouraging them to be unreasonable because that's what I'm going to reward. I'm going to reward it by giving them the things that they want that maybe I wouldn't otherwise for whatever reason, I'm also going to reward it by not making them do the things that they don't want to do, unless they are the most compliant, unless they are the path of least resistance. What eventually that will lead to is even my oldest child, once he gets wise and realizes that this is the way that the game is played, he'll become very difficult and he'll become resentful on top of that. So it's very important in raising children or in any kind of relationship that we don't take just the path of least resistance all the time, or I would say even most of the time. Most of the time, it's not a good idea. I would say the exception is when you are in a crisis or when it is an emergency, when time is of the essence, and it just needs to happen right now. It doesn't matter who does it, just somebody needs to step up and do what needs to be done. Now, Mattis might say, well, that's what we're in right now. We are in a crisis. We are in a national crisis. Our country is tearing itself apart, and we need to take the path of least resistance to calm things down, to de-escalate the situation. Cooler heads will prevail. Talk with the people who are reasonable. Yes, it places an undue burden on them, but that is just what is required for our national well-being and for our domestic tranquility. He might hold that position if you were really going to press him on it. I don't know. I don't know if he is that self-aware to realize maybe what's going on here. It doesn't really matter to my main point. From my perspective, objectively, I see this as a very similar scenario where you have two parties. Think of it like two sons. You have two parties. You have a responsible, fiscally conservative party that wants to do the right thing. In general, in principle, their platform is aligned with what's true and what's right. You also have the other party, which wants free stuff for its constituents. It wants to buy votes. It wants to bribe people to put it into power and to keep it in power and to expand its power. It wants to promise the sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And cost is not an object. And debt is not an object. And practicality is not an object. All you have to do is say phrases like, if we don't do this, then black people are going to die. All you have to do is claim that there's a war on women. All that you have to do is say, think of the children. All you have to do is play emotional mind games and be manipulative, and you get what you want. You be the most difficult person, and eventually the Republicans, that party, and the American people will insist that you, as the path of least resistance, cave in to whatever the demands are. It's okay. It's just this once. They'll get tired of playing with this if you just give it to them. So far, in our history, taking the long view, that has not happened. It has not been the case that the Democrats get tired of power. They always want more power. It has not been the case that they get tired of their programs being always expanded and never contracted. So long as they have any constituents who want those programs expanded, who are going to keep putting them into office without term limits, without a limitation on the number of times they can run for high office and then pander to their special interest groups to get kickbacks, to get special perks, to get favorable MVP treatment. So long as that is the case, they will keep expanding programs and they will resist vehemently all efforts to contract programs. They will keep passing regulations and they will not scale back regulations so long as their special interest groups and their lobbyists are saying, this is what you have to do to get our money. As long as foreign governments and companies and corporations in other countries are saying, this is what we want you to do, and if you don't do it, we're going to back your opponent. We're going to make sure that whoever primaries against you gets the funding that they need, gets the favorable media coverage that they need. We have our fingers and our tendrils, our tentacles into enough of your process in your country, we can make life very hard for you and your family. To take the path of least resistance at this point in our history, when things are so abundantly clear, if you pay attention to current events and if you read history, taking the path of least resistance is not only a bad idea, it's not merely foolish, it is irresponsible. It is to be complicit, to be a party to corruption, to the perversion of justice. And in the case of rioters and looters and arsonists and people who are making threats of violence and then carrying out threats of violence against law enforcement and private citizens for trying to protect the innocent, for trying to protect private property, we have now reached a tipping point where it is time to either fight or to surrender. If we're not going to fight, we are going to surrender. And it is just a question of time. It is only a matter of time before this mania envelops the entire country. And if you think that you're going to wait until the next election is over, if you think that you're going to play it safe and you're going to let this opportunity pass and you're just going to bide your time, and maybe we win a couple more seats in the House, maybe we win a couple more seats in the Senate, maybe we get reelected to the White House, maybe we can get some more conservative judges. The people that are rioting and looting and assaulting private citizens and law enforcement, they are not being voted in. They are insurrectionists. And the media is absolutely a party to this evil that is being perpetrated in our country. They're a party to it by covering it in a favorable way and covering all efforts to resist it, to push back against it, to hold it accountable as evil, to stir people up to insurrection by their lies and their slander, by their making of everything into a scandal, when they never did the same to previous administrations. They never did the same to Obama, at the very least. They never do the same to the progressives. They only do this to Republicans, to conservatives, to those who are opposing the progressive agenda. They are casting violence and destruction of property and insurrection as peaceful protest. And if they can show you an image of someone who's not assaulting a police officer, who's not spitting on him, who's not chipping away at a corner of a sidewalk so that they can start throwing the chunks at cops and through windows of businesses, if they can show you a picture of a peaceful protester, that does not prove that these are peaceful protests. It doesn't. They are liars. They are slanderers. They are bearing false witness against their neighbor, and they are then stirring up the people against their own government and against their neighbors. What they are doing is evil. It is not just politics as usual. This is a revolution underway as we're watching before our very eyes. And the American people, there is a strong minority of American conservatives who are not going to go for that. We are not going to go for that. It doesn't matter how you dress it up. It doesn't matter how much lipstick you put on that pig. It's still going to be a pig. But there are a lot of undecided Americans in the middle who haven't been paying attention. They've been entertaining themselves. They've been amusing themselves to death, as Neil Postman puts it in his famous 1985 book. They have been playing on their video games and watching their sports and watching their movies and having a grand old time their whole lives. And now that you tell them this is really serious and this could be life or death, it really harshes their groove. And they don't know what to make of it because they haven't equipped themselves with this knowledge. And the evangelical community, which has been sedated, has been anesthetized to the surgery, to the removal of organs from a live, living patient so that those can be donated to somebody else for money. They've been sedated by Christian leaders and pseudo-Christians and false Christians and a false gospel into thinking that if you believe in truth and justice in the American way, that is at odds with the gospel. If you are a conservative American, that is somehow in conflict with your Christianity. You have to pick one or the other. You can't be both. And if you're going to be about Jesus, then you have to share the gospel But by golly, you'd better not talk about Donald Trump because that'll ruin your testimony. By golly, you'd better not talk about abortion because that's going to ruin your testimony. You'd better not talk about law and order and about justice because that's going to ruin your testimony. Those Christians, even if they were paying attention in secret, they are terrified of speaking up because they're afraid that their fellow congregants and their clergy are going to shout them down. Not shout them down, they're going to wag the finger at them and scold them and say, that is not what Jesus would do. You should not be doing this. You are not honoring your Father who is in heaven. You're not honoring God. You're not loving him with all of your being. You're making an idol out of this world and the things of this world. Tell me this, hypothetically speaking, suppose tonight someone breaks into my home and they have a gun pointed at my pregnant wife and they're threatening harm to my children and they want to set my house on fire. If I am focused on eliminating their ability to harm my wife and children and my home and my person, is that me making an idol out of my family? Is that making an idol out of my home? Is that making an idol out of my personal safety? Or is that responsible? Is that, holistically speaking, with regards to the scriptures, what I am called to do as a husband and a father and a man? Is that my responsibility? Because if it's my responsibility, then don't you dare tell me that that is at odds with the gospel. And Jesus talks in the Gospels about how no one breaks into the home of a strong man when he is armed and forewarned of their coming. And he uses that as an analogy to talk about Satan coming as a thief in the night to try and steal and destroy. The enemy is going to try and destroy you. Be sober and vigilant, for your adversary the devil goes about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Those kinds of word pictures don't come into being because we are supposed to be passive. They don't come into being from Jesus' own lips because self-defense is sinful, is making too much of this earthly world. God made this creation. God also commanded that we do justice. If you read Matthew, if you read Micah 6:8, if you read the epistles, if you read the Old Testament and New Testament, God commanded that justice be done, and he defined what justice is and what it isn't. He gave stark warnings about not using unequal weights and measures when you're meting out justice, because God hates them. They are an abomination to him. And if we're going to sit here and we're going to pretend and play church as though cowardice is the most spiritual route we could possibly go for in our current climate, then shame on us. Shame on us. We are taking the path of least resistance because we think that by so doing, we can save our own skins. They'll come for us last. We'll wait until this all blows over. If they come for us last and we somehow are able to persuade them to see reason because we listened, we compromised, then they'll spare us. They'll spare the ones we love. They'll spare the things that we care about. It ain't so. I want you to consider the words of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah 6:13-15 in the English Standard Version says, "For from the least to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for unjust gain, and from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have healed the wound of my people lightly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace. Were they ashamed when they committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed. They did not know how to blush. Therefore they shall fall among those who fall. At the time that I punish them, they shall be overthrown, says Yahweh." Now, you can consider that the prophet Jeremiah is writing within a certain context that's important. This is referring to God's people, Israel. This is God's prophet coming to speak to his people, Israel. And the specifics of this passage pertaining to a specific context does not negate some general principles that we can derive from this. One of those principles is that God himself will do justice. Let me say that again. God himself will do justice. Justice will be served. It doesn't matter if you believe in God. It doesn't matter if you don't believe in God. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever. God will do justice. And when we read in the scriptures, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord, it should strike fear into the hearts of those who are evil, who practice evil. They don't just accidentally every now and then mess up and slip and do the wrong thing. They practice evil. They don't just accidentally get swept up in some fake news and say something that they heard from the rumor mill about somebody that they know, and then it turns out to be false. Those who are practicing evil specifically sit down to figure out how to destroy their enemies and destroy the people that they don't like, and just destroy people for fun, just to feel powerful, just to flex their muscles. Slandering and lying about and spreading rumors they know to be false for malicious ends. This is no small part of why due process is critically important. It should require more than an accusation to send somebody to jail. It should require more than a rumor or an accusation for somebody's career to be canceled, for their job to be terminated, for their employment to be terminated, for them to be difficult to hire for anybody else. Unfortunately, what we find ourselves living through right now is this kind of witch hunt mentality where the social justice warriors and the left throw out the accusation that somebody is a sexist, someone is a racist, someone is a misogynist, someone is a homophobe or a transphobe or an Islamophobe or a xenophobe or whatever. The accusation is thrown out, and if they work for a big corporation, particularly if they have a managerial position or if they're highly positioned in a progressive organization at any level, it can cost them their job. And you will only hear about the story as you're hearing that they also lost their job. You'll only hear about the accusation as you're hearing that they were terminated. And more often than not, or always, in all of the examples that I know of, there is a thick layer of interpretation on top of what actually happened, what actually was said, what actually was done. And that thick layer of interpretation usually amounts to, they said this and it means that. They said this and I interpret it this other way. It's basically the same as saying this over here, and since that is such an ugly, offensive thing to say, it's close enough that they said this other thing, and so we're just going to condemn them for it. You think about this soccer player for Los Angeles team. Just this past week, he lost his position on the team because his wife reportedly posted something to social media which was alleged to be racist. And so next thing you know, the team is putting out a statement saying that he had been released from the team because of his wife's supposedly offensive, inappropriate comments. Now, whether they actually were offensive or not is beside the point, to the fact that he was not the one posting these things to social media. So why was he the one losing his job? You think about Drew Brees, NFL player, widely popular, highly acclaimed, very skilled. He comes out and he says, in the midst of all this Black Lives Matter business, that he doesn't put up with people disrespecting the United States of America flag, that represents to him our country, and you should not disrespect our flag. ESPN and the sports journalist corps that is very activist and very in the bag for the left And his fellow players in the league got absolutely after him. And the next thing you know, he's issuing an apology. I'm sorry if what I said was offensive to some. I should not have said those things. I deeply regret them. What I meant to say is Black Lives Matter. And so he will hopefully be allowed to keep his job. But I'll tell you what, he is on thin ice because he has caught the attention of the outrage mob. And if he says anything else, which could be interpreted to mean that he is not totally in favor of all of the social justice business and Black Lives Matter and the left, I'll bet you his career will be canceled. What all of this means is, for those who are saying peace, peace, for those who are trying to heal the wounds of our people lightly, it is greed for unjust gain, that they want to curry favor with people who are corrupt, with people who are maliciously slandering, bearing false witness against their neighbor, trying to destroy their fellow man with false accusations. It is intolerable that we would say peace, peace, when there is no peace, that we would call for unity with those people. What fellowship does light have with darkness? What does that look like if you want me to extend an olive branch to a slanderer, but in order for them to be at peace with me, I have to affirm their slanderous accusations against other people? How does that work? How does that work that I maintain my testimony, so-called, by affirming false statements, false allegations on their part, or even just statements and allegations which I don't know to be true? Since when do I need to affirm that? Since when do I even need to affirm that they have feelings about that? If they are a liar, or if they are parroting the false allegations of other liars, it doesn't matter how they feel about it. They can be angry until they explode. It doesn't change the fact that they are on the wrong side. It doesn't change the fact that there is an injustice that they are perpetrating and supporting. And it doesn't change our responsibility. Our focus should be asking the question of what is true. Jesus says at one point, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Pontius Pilate was the one who asked, what is truth, in a very cynical fashion, as he had an innocent man that he was about to condemn and then wash his hands of the blood guilt of. Pontius Pilate was the one who asked, what is truth? We as Christians cannot, in good conscience, say, what is truth, as we prefer peace and unity with evildoers over the truth and over actual biblical justice. Vodi Bakum brings up an excellent point that you don't have any adjective added on to justice in the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament. You don't find the phrase social justice anywhere in the Bible. And Tim Keller of the Gospel Coalition is way off base. I have no time for him. I have no time for the Gospel Coalition, even though they've had people who I think were unaware of their involvement with social justice and their being radical and subverting actual true biblical justice with their stances on things. But Tim Keller goes as far as to say that social justice is biblical justice. They're one and the same. And that is not true. In the scriptures, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you don't have the phrase social justice showing up anywhere. And if you define social justice and then you define biblical justice, they are not in agreement. They're not. Claims to the contrary, with a hocus pocus and a lot of spiritual sounding, just trust me, I'm a pastor, just trust me, I am a co-founder of the Gospel Coalition, does not cut it. That will not do. That is not sufficient. You need to have a better argument than that. And unfortunately, they don't. And they don't have to when their audience is comprised of people who are led around by their feelings, who are led around by sentiment, whether that's a positive feeling or that's a negative feeling. Whether that's, I am really angry. You just told me something that is an injustice and I'm angry about it. And I don't need to hear the truth about it. I'm just angry and somebody needs to pay. Or whether that's a positive emotion. I feel really good about myself when I affirm all of these things that the left is telling me I have to say so that I can be at peace with them. I feel really good about my future prosperity, my future prospects, when I say things that are going to keep me on good terms with the left. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Christians who are taken in by this, and they're not familiar enough with their Bible to know any better. They have not been Bereans. They have not been of a more noble sort, like those who checked the scriptures daily to see whether the things that Paul and Barnabas told them about Christ were true. Paul and Barnabas were preaching the true gospel, and they praised efforts on the part of the Berean Jews to double check their math, to make sure that what they were claiming was supported by God's word. That should tell us everything that we need to know about any teacher who holds themselves up as a supposed authority on Christ and the gospel and God. If when you ask questions, when you double check them against the scriptures, you're decried as being somehow rebellious, somehow stiff-necked, somehow ignorant. That will not do. That will not do. Paul, the apostle, did not stoop to that. In fact, he praised the Bereans. And we need to be Bereans about these things. Paul wrote to Timothy in one of his 2 letters, and he said that we should study to show ourselves approved workmen who need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Rightly dividing the word of truth. That means not just knowing what God's word says, not just knowing what's true in a biblical sense, but knowing truth from falsehood in a general sense. That dovetails very neatly with Micah 6:8. That dovetails very neatly with all biblical law in the Old Testament, where we read that guilt is to be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. But you don't get one person saying, he said this thing, it triggered me, I'm really angry, I equated what he had said with violence against my person and against this special class, and therefore you should fire him. Therefore, he should lose his job. He should lose his ability to provide for his family, his ability to make a living. That's not okay. That is not okay. We can't be a party to that. We can't be a party to reparations talk. We can't be a party to the slanderous accusations against all white Americans that they're all racist, that the white church in America was complicit with this for hundreds of years, when we know for a fact that it was white abolitionists in England and in America who campaigned for the abolition of slavery after hearing the testimony of escaped slaves. We cannot go along with these slanders against God's word, against the truth, against our neighbors, and against ourselves. We have to push back. We have to. Saying peace, peace will not do. Yes, it does say in the New Testament, insofar as it depends upon you, strive to live peaceably with all men. But notice that is not a absolute statement, totally unconditional and 100% dependent on you. Inherent to the statement is the promise that it does not depend entirely on you. When it says insofar as it depends on you, that means it doesn't entirely depend on you, and it shouldn't. And anyone who comes to you angrily shouting accusations and telling you that you are all these things, these awful things, and therefore they have a right to abuse you, that your friends, your family, your coworkers, your country is all of these ugly things, and therefore they have a right to mistreat you. They are not in the right. And living peaceably with them is not going to look the same as living peaceably with a neighbor who is kind and fair and equitable and reasonable. These accusations that are being bandied about are not in good faith. They're not reasonable, and they should not be legitimated. They should not be encouraged. They should not be rewarded. And if we take the path of least resistance with these things, we are feeding a monster which will not only devour us, it will devour those we care about. And if we are Christians and we say, yes, the underground church historically throughout the world, in the past and present, has been persecuted. And so, even so, come Lord Jesus, let there be persecution here so that we can show that our faith is real. If you can't stand up to this right now, then you're not ready for that. Changing gears a little bit, I finished a couple of books this past week, which caused me to think about what's going on in our country a little bit differently. One of them was a great little read called Legion versus Phalanx, in which several battles between the Greeks and the Romans were analyzed to figure out why it was that the Romans ended up conquering the Greeks. Why did they win out? Why was their unique unit, their unique soldier and way of war superior to that of the Greeks, who had been highly effective against the Persians and many other tribes and groups for so long? Another book I listened to was Hart's Strategy, the Indirect Approach. And that one was interesting for its admonition that when you're trying to accomplish a strategic goal, it is often best to take an approach which is not apparent. If your enemy leaves you an option which is very obvious, which seems like it's the easiest, it's probably a trap. If there's another way that you can go about things which your enemy is not going to expect you to try, it's less likely they will have their defenses up for you to attack them on that front at that time in that place. Now, along these lines, what Hart has to say about strategy very much agrees with what many other famous strategists throughout history have either written or applied in their execution of strategy. And that is that warfare is all about attacking your enemy where they're weak, when they don't expect it, and eliminating their will to fight. If you can eliminate their will to fight, you don't have to fight. If you can win battles without bloodshed, all the better. That's something Sun Tzu says. That's something that a great many very effective generals have applied in their prosecution of war. The goal is not to kill as many bodies as you can. It's not to completely eliminate your enemy's army. Your goal is to eliminate your enemy's will to fight you. If they'll surrender, then you win, even if you didn't have to fight a single battle. And all the better if you didn't take any losses, in case there's an enemy you're going to face down the road who is going to fight you. You can save your strength through them. In case you're going to have to not risk losing based on your larger strategic goals. Your strategic goals, if you're trying to conquer a people, if you're trying to defend your own country, your strategic goals should not be limited to just defeating this enemy. You don't want to get tunnel vision. You want to think big picture. What about after that? What do I want to do after this battle, after this war? And am I going to be in a position to do that? And if I'm not, then what is the point exactly of winning this battle or winning this war? We need to think about that. So this has me thinking about the situation with Black Lives Matter, with Antifa, with the radical left, which has taken over the Democratic Party, which now calls rioters and looters peaceful protesters, which writes in major magazines and newspapers across the country that burning down a city and burning down a police station and defunding the police, that's basically the same thing as the Boston Tea Party. I mean, let's be real here. In fact, if you object to the one and you remember fondly the fact that there was the other at the beginning of this nation's history at its founding, then you are a racist. You're basically saying that black people can't be as American as those early colonists who were white. You racist. Well, here's what's beautiful and also evil about that way of advancing the leftist agenda. It accomplishes their aim of demoralizing their enemy without fighting. Yes, there is violence that's taking American streets and scaring people. Yes, there are buildings and businesses that have been burned down, a police station in Minneapolis that was burned down, cars set on fire in the middle of the streets. Yes, there are people who have been hurt and killed in all of this. But relatively speaking, compared with how large this country is, to be cowed by what has happened thus far would be the height of cowardice. It would be ridiculous for us to cave in to these insurrectionists. That's what they are. They're not protesters. They're not merely saying, we want representation in our government. They have representation in their government. What they want is absolute power. They want to make every last little decision, and not only for the nation, for you as an individual. They want to make every decision as to what you can say, what you can't say, what you can do, what you can't do, what you can have and what you can't have. They are Marxists. They are Marxists. And they're using psychological warfare to convince us that we should let them have their way. We should just go with it. They are trying to win a war without fighting. And in that sense, it's smart, it's very intelligent, it's very clever, but it's evil, because what they want to do with this country, if they take it, is evil. They want to bring about and enact a communist state here in America. They want full-on control of the means of production by the state. They want to centrally plan our food production and distribution and our healthcare system and our education. They want to eliminate your ability to homeschool your kids. They want to eliminate the idea that there is any such thing as a nuclear family, that there's a husband and there's a wife and there's a mother and there's a father and there's gender. They want to abolish all of that and decide for you what you can teach your children, what you can think, what you can feel, what you can believe, what you can say, what you can do. They want to, in essence, abolish American liberty. But they're dressing it up as trying to protect minorities, trying to protect black people, trying to protect people of color in this country from being slaughtered in the streets, which is an outrageous claim. The statistics do not bear that out at all. Over 90% of blacks in America are killed by other blacks. They're not killed by the police. They're sure as hell not killed by white people. They're killed by other blacks. They're killing themselves. They're murdering one another. And even in the case of violence and homicides between the races, whether it's black on white or white on black, over 90% of intra-racial violence in this country is black on white. So don't come to me trying to browbeat me, trying to guilt trip me, trying to shame me as if I am a racist when I say, no. The only thing to salvage your reputation and your volition at this point is to back up, turn around, and go the other direction. C.S. Lewis has a great quote, which is relevant here. We all want progress, but if you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. In that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive. What Lewis means by this is, if you're wrong and you want to claim that you're about progress, once it becomes apparent you are mistaken in this, you cannot continue to claim that you are for progress unless you admit that you were mistaken and you go the other direction. I think about Dave Rubin doing an interview with Larry Elder years ago, and Dave Rubin refers back to this now as the moment in which he turned away from leftism and progressivism and became a conservative after a fashion. Now, he's still independent-minded on certain issues. He still thinks maybe a little bit differently on certain things, but in general, all of a sudden, his whole concept of political philosophy and of his positions here in America changed when Larry Elder asked him to prove the case. As a black man, as a lawyer, prove to me that America is systemically racist against black people. Go. And Dave Rubin hems and haws, and I guess there's certain people that, and he couldn't do it. The bottom line is he couldn't do it. It's a great interview. Go look it up. Go Google it. Go YouTube it. Dave Rubin couldn't do it. And Larry Elder said, that's not true. Here are the facts. Here are the statistics. This is what it actually is. And too many black people and too many progressives in this country have been told that this lie is the reality because the Democratic Party wants to control them. It wants to use them. It wants them to work as pawns in this larger chess game that the Democrats are playing, that the left is playing in America. If we are really for progress, once we realize that, once we have begun to ask the question, we should not slam the door on that because we've come this far and we just got to keep going. No, that's not progress. That's not progress. That's actually regress. The last thing that I want to leave off this episode talking about is what kneeling communicates. And what I mean by that is during Colin Kaepernick's awakening as a political activist, kneeling became a form of protest during the national anthem, a way of saying, we are not going to stand here and honor our country so long as black people are allegedly being oppressed still today in America. I worked with a friend of Colin Kaepernick's adoptive parents who had moved to eastern Montana from California years ago. She said she had gone to church with his parents, had get-togethers with Colin Kaepernick's adoptive family and him. He seemed like a nice guy, and then he went to college. He became a Muslim and got all wrapped up in this black power stuff and this black oppression, black nationalism business. And when he joined the NFL, he was doing okay. He was moderately successful. And something changed. Something happened where his white adoptive parents, who were wealthy and had taken good care of him and taken him in, somehow became a scapegoat, and all of white America with them. Somehow he ended up resenting all of white America, and to the point that he couldn't even stand with hand on his heart during the national anthem. It was an offensive thing that he was going to protest. Now, when he initially did this, it was considered rude. It was considered disrespectful. There was a lot of backlash against it. And gradually, little by little, the league and a lot of players and a lot of Americans in broader society ended up thinking that Kaepernick was a hero. So he got a sweet cush promotional deal with Nike and was able to sell sneakers for them and got lots of money for it. And he became a person of the year. He became this symbol. He ended up not being such a fantastic football player as he was activist. And I think that's maybe part of why he decided to switch games. He switched from the football game to the political activism game. The football thing was starting to dry up. He saw that his days were numbered, and so he decided to switch gears. But you fast forward, and now you have people kneeling as a sign of their solidarity, as a gesture of their solidarity. They're standing with Black Lives Matter. And in so doing, many Americans don't think about that fact of Black Lives Matter being a statement. Yes, Black lives are important to me, is separate and distinct from Black Lives Matter, all caps, the organization. The organization has a political agenda which is radically Marxist, which is all about being queer, affirming, and down with the nuclear family, and we don't need husbands and fathers, and we're just going to raise these children as a community. It takes a village to raise an idiot, as someone once here recently quipped to me. Black Lives Matter as a movement is a separate piece from Black Lives Matter as a statement. Black lives are important. They have intrinsic value and worth because they're created in God's image. As Matt Walsh pointed out earlier this week for his 500th episode, if you care about Black lives, put your money where your mouth is and call for defunding Planned Parenthood. Don't call for defunding the police. Defund Planned Parenthood, because, by golly, Planned Parenthood murders far more. We're talking thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands more Black Americans every year than the cops do. And yet, Black Lives Matter, the organization, does not care about those lives. It doesn't care about those Black lives. If you want to say that Black Lives Matter, then you should care about Black lives for having intrinsic value and worth even in the womb. Not aborting them. Not murdering them. But to kneel with Black Lives Matter protesters for politicians and police chiefs and law enforcement and EMTs and white Americans and Black Americans, for that matter, to kneel in solidarity with Black Lives Matter is a bad idea. It is a terrible idea. You think that you're extending an olive branch and you're making this positive gesture, and I've seen videos of it. It would be moving. It would be an emotional, touching moment if it weren't for the fact that I know what Black Lives Matter as a movement wants. I know what their agenda is. I know what their goals are, and we should not be for those things. There's a lot of pork in this legislation that's being rammed through, and we're going to wake up on the other side of this, having empowered these people, and ask ourselves, what in the world? Why didn't I read the fine print? Why didn't I know that this was part of the package deal? I didn't sign up for this. It's important that we realize that kneeling, in the sense that Colin Kaepernick was doing it during the national anthem at the beginning of NFL games, was a protest against paying tribute to our country and to our nation, because our country was systemically racist, and he could not respect our country because of that. Now, for one thing, I don't at all, in any way, shape, or form, respect the right of a woman to choose to murder her child via abortion. Whatever you want to call it, if you want to call it abortion, if you want to call it infanticide, if you want to call it murder, plain old-fashioned murder, I don't support a woman having any right to do that, because it's extremely wrong. It is about the most vile shedding of innocent blood I can think of. But I will stand with my hand on my heart when the national anthem plays, because this country is imperfect, but this is our country. And by and large, this country has done more good than bad, and because I want to see this country change its wicked ways, and I don't see overthrowing the entire system as necessary or even desirable toward the end of getting those changes that need to be made accomplished, taking the corruption out of the process as it is right now. I don't think that we have to overthrow the entire system in order to do that. And so I'm not going to take a knee. I'm not going to just stand there stoically with my hat on and protest the national anthem. So what gives Colin Kaepernick the right? What gives anybody else the right as an American, benefiting so greatly, I should add, from this supposedly systemically racist country? What gives him the right to protest that and then lead a movement to upend the entire system by accusing the system and everybody who's participated in it of being corrupt? On what basis? What gives you the right to make that charge? What are your facts? Present more than your feelings to me. Make your case. But if you're just going to give me sentiment and a spectacle, I am under no obligation to respect that just because you're a person of color at all. And for law enforcement, for emergency personnel, for politicians to take a knee, for Democrats to spend 8 minutes kneeling in Washington, D.C., wearing these culturally appropriated scarves in an African traditional pattern, it's a photo op. If you're going to condemn Trump for going over to St. John's across the street from the White House in Washington, D.C. after it gets firebombed and holding a Bible for pictures to be taken, where are you when Schumer and Pelosi are taking a knee for 8 minutes? They don't do that for anybody, but they're doing it with George Floyd because they want to win political points. They're doing it with George Floyd, with the Black Lives Matter crowd, because they're desperate to not lose this coming election. They're desperate to get anything they can use to beat Trump and the Republicans and the conservatives of America over the head and win and get power. So when I see law enforcement and others taking a knee because they think that that's going to win them points, brownie points in favor with the left, it disgusts me. Just know this is not a cost-benefit analysis where there's no cost and there's only benefit. It disgusts me that you are bowing down to a false narrative. And in so doing, you're affirming, you're reinforcing a unfair, unjust, false accusation, a slander on the character of this country, on the character of your neighbors, on the character of your own selves, if the truth were known. As cops, do you think that they're going to stop chanting about defunding the police because you took a knee? Is that what this is about? And if they don't defund your agency and they defund anybody else that didn't bend the knee to them, what is that? Since when did it become a litmus test that you either get to retain your power, you either get to retain your ability to serve the public, or you don't, based on whether you literally get down on your knees before Black Lives Matter, before leftists in this country? When did that happen? What happened to our country that has just become a feature? And it's either that or we're going to burn your cities down. The path of least resistance is, in this case, appearing for those people to be to go along with the Black Lives Matter crowd, to de-escalate, to appease them, to affirm them, to write and do interviews like Jim Mattis is doing, where he blasts the president for politicizing and for dividing this country, and he leaves the Democrats unscathed. He leaves them untouched. No, you don't get to do that. You are a coward. You are a sellout. You've lost my respect. You've lost my trust. You are selling this country out. For all you pastors who are going along with the Black Lives Matter, for the head of the Southern Baptist Convention coming out and saying, let's all come together, and like it's the liturgy, like we're reading the liturgy. I want you all to repeat after me. Black Lives Matter. Shame on you. Shame on you. Shame on you, because it was not in question whether we believed that Black Lives Matter. How dare you suggest that that was up for debate? It's a false choice, and this is highly manipulative what's going on. This is a fool's choice. We are being given a double-blind, lose-lose scenario because the people who are doing this to our country, who are taking it hostage, are highly manipulative, narcissistic, self-absorbed, mama and daddy's basement-dwelling creeps. And it breaks my heart to see so many going along with it. And the more who go along with it, the more of a self-fulfilling prophecy it is when people say, well, this is just what it is now. No, I don't accept that. I don't accept that this is the way that it is now, and there are a lot of other Americans who don't accept that this is the way that it is right now. This is you going along with it. I understand that that's the way that it is, that you're a coward. I understand that there's a lot of people who are being empowered right now who are abusive and who are slandering their neighbors, who are bearing false witness against their neighbors. I understand that due process is going right out the window, and you're going to throw indictments and charges against people now. You're going to fire them based on accusations, based on outrage of the mob. I realize that we're headed towards torches and pitchforks, but I don't accept that that's the way that it needs to be. And by golly, you shouldn't either. And none of us should, because this is terribly dangerous territory that we're going into, that we've already entered, and we're going deeper and deeper into. Turn back now, or else there will be a very high cost to pay. If we think this is the path of least resistance, we have another thing coming, and it's best that we double check our math now before it's too late. With that, on not a particularly happy note, but it is what it is, I conclude this video. Thank you for watching. If you think I'm completely bonkers and off my rocker, by all means email me, contact me on social media. You can find any of my social media accounts with a quick search of Garrett Ashley Mullet on Google. And feel free to reach out. Let me know if you agree with what I'm saying, but you have more to add. If you think that I'm maybe mistaken, if you've got a different explanation, different perspective, leave it in the comments below. Hit subscribe on my YouTube channel. And as always, be well. Thanks for watching, and God bless.